Thanks, Frank. Thank you for having me. I'm going to use the microphone. I also got mic'd up for the camera, so I got a lot of things going on up here, so bear with me. Thanks for having me again. Like Frank said, I'm originally from this area. I still live here, although a little further east in Oak Park Heights. But I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I did come here about 5 or so years ago and presented our State Patrol Traffic Safety teen driver education program to this group. As Frank said, my full-time job is as a captain with the State Patrol. I run our Capitol Security and Executive Protection section. It's very busy with the activities at the state capitol and other political things that go on around the state that we get involved in. But today I'm here to talk to you about a business I started this spring, MG Security Group. And the point, my purpose when I got into this was I graduated from the U of M going on just over a year ago with my security technologies master's degree, and I looked at how that applied to what I do in my regular job with the state. But I also saw an opportunity as I did research and projects in that group or in that program to help businesses be more resilient and set themselves up to not only survive, but get back up on their feet if they have something bad happen to them. Now, active shooter events, violent intruder events, they typically get the headlines and they happen all too often. But if you think about it, we have things that impact our businesses every day. It may be weather events, it may be power outages, things that disrupt our regular activities. Now, while a violent intruder is an extreme example of that, if we prepare our businesses and we have plans and procedures and train our employees to deal with those severe cases, such as this, it also pays dividends in those little things that pop up from time to time that cause disruptions for us as well. Like I said, these events get all the attraction and we want to be prepared for those, but in reality the likelihood is very small. It's something you can't ignore, but again, their likelihood is not great. But if we can prepare for these events, it'll also make us more resilient in other realms. So a little bit about the company I started. Our mission statement, it's pretty simple. You want to, if you're going to start an organization, you got to know what you're about. You can read that. We want to provide safety, help organizations become more resilient, train their employees by providing high-level and innovative training, risk education, and risk management services. My core values: integrity, trust, value, innovation. As a law enforcement officer, my whole life, integrity is something that's not compromisable. We have to have that trust. Anytime you're going to hire someone to do something for you, you got to be able to trust them. Value. We have a saying in the security business: it's not cheap or convenient. Every time we add a layer of security, we typically make things a little more expensive and a little more difficult. But we also have to balance that out with, if we create a situation where our organization can't function because it's locked down like Fort Knox, it's not any good to anybody. So you have to take a balanced approach and really look at what are we willing to accept for risk and what do we need to take measures to prevent. And then innovation. The core tenet of the program I went through at the U is innovation. It's using technology to protect our critical infrastructures in this country and using that in an innovative way from a leadership perspective. So although the program is in the College of Science and Engineering, I'm not an engineer. We have a heavy cybersecurity element to the class. I learned enough about that to be dangerous, but not too much. But I really focused on the physical protection, physical security, and infrastructure protection. And when you boil that down, whether you're talking about the electrical grid for the entire country or your organization, the same frameworks apply. It's just a matter of scaling it to the need at the time. Just a little bit about, again, what I do: training and education, security consulting, risk management. It's all on my website. I've got business cards if you want to know more about that. We'll get to that. You can do that later. But I want to get into what I'm really here to talk about today. Frank already introduced me, talked about my background and experience. Started out in River Falls, Wisconsin as a police officer, then came to the State Patrol 20 years ago. I did a lot of different things, including being our agency spokesperson for about 5 years. But when I was out on the road, besides being a state trooper doing traffic enforcement, I spent a lot of time training. I was on our SWAT team for 9 years. Spent a significant amount of that time as a sniper for our SWAT team, and then did a lot of training, large-scale training for our agency and others. We talked about this already. In addition to my education through the formal education, I'm also a certified emergency management, or I received my certification in emergency management from the state a couple years ago, and then went through some other law enforcement leadership training through the FBI. And then just a couple associations I work with. ACES, if you're familiar with them, it's a national organization focusing on industrial security. And then ATAP is Association of Threat Assessment Professionals. So what that is somebody comes to you with a concern. I'm worried my coworker said something that I'm worried about them doing something violent, or I'm trying to assess that. ATAP sets up frameworks for assessing threats, making reasonable decisions on how you address that problem. So it's really threat assessment from a perspective of individuals. So what are we trying to prevent here? What is the whole point of this? Well, the worst shock through a workforce, no matter what size agency or organization you have, is something that happens outside the realm of expectations that in retrospect people say, you know what, we should have been prepared for that. And you know, it is Monday morning quarterbacking to a certain extent, but there are certain things that when they happen, oftentimes it's not a surprise to anybody. We've seen this with violent actions. You know, you look at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas School in Florida, there's a lot of red flags there. When we look at other situations, Virginia Tech, there were a lot of red flags, especially immediately preceding that event, that should have been picked up on, frankly, and addressed. But we have a tendency to rationalize things as humans. We don't want to think about the worst case scenario. We always think, well, that's just somebody saying something that's a little crazy. And so you need someone within your organization that can take a look at these things and assess them and say, is this something we need to worry about, or is this something that's just utterance in a moment of passion? In my regular job with the patrol, we deal with this all the time. I can't tell you how many threatening communications come into our elected officials. You have to assess those and decide which ones we need to take greater action on, and which ones might be someone who had a couple drinks, was on the computer at 2 a.m. and let something fly because they watched whatever national news organization they prefer for too long. So, but what this does, when these things happen, as you can see in the second bullet, it undermines the faith in the organization. When everybody recognizes we should have been prepared for that. It doesn't matter if it's a violent intruder, a weather event, a power outage, a single point of failure because we have an employee that's the only person that can do this, and if something happens to them, we're finished. All of those things are oftentimes predictable. And as a mentor, I'd say that I followed, his name's Gordon Graham. He's a risk manager out of California. He says if it's predictable, it's preventable. And it boils down to something that simple. So we talk about these things. Cohesion and organizational climate play a significant role. What kind of, from a leadership perspective, you're all leaders here in the room, how do you address these things to your employees? Do you dismiss their concerns? Do we address them? Do you have some way, if they tell you they have a concern about a coworker or somebody is displaying behavior that is making everybody worried, do you know what you're going to do about that? Do they have faith that if they report it to you, there's some system or some process for addressing it? It's difficult in widespread organizations, but often you look at the 3Ms, the larger companies, they have this stuff because they have full-time security personnel. They have full-time threat assessment teams that work with these things. What I've learned, and when I started exploring opening this business and pursuing it, is the smaller businesses like my parents and probably many of yours, you got a lot going on. You've got to make sure the doors are open, the income's coming in, you're still able to function. And sometimes this stuff can take a back seat because it's not right in front of you at the time. So how do we balance that out and decide, are we going to invest resources in our security and resiliency? How much time and energy do we have to do that when we're not really sure the likelihood of a problem? Well, we can never actually predict what's going to happen, and if we could, that would be great, but the reality is we can't, and sometimes these things come up out of the blue. But if we create an organizational climate where we bring forth an attitude that we're prepared, we're not paranoid, but we recognize stuff can happen. And while we can't control all of that, what we can do is take some reasonable steps to prepare our organization. So preparation. You can read the bullet points of why it's important, but I want to tell one story, and it's not a personal experience of mine. But is anybody familiar with who Rick Rescorla is? Anybody heard that name? So he was the security director for Morgan Stanley in the World Trade Center. A little bit about him. I don't know if you can see on the photo the patch that's on the right shoulder of his uniform. He was in the cavalry unit that was featured in the movie We Were Soldiers. He's a very fascinating man, a lot of background to him, but he was born in England, came to America, joined the Army, went to Vietnam, was in that unit that was featured in the movie, and afterwards got into corporate security. So Morgan Stanley hires him. He goes to work at the World Trade Center. He recognizes the way things are in the world and say, this is really a symbol of America. It's a symbol of capitalism. This would be a really good target for someone. And he reached out to some of his Army friends, said, hey guys, I got this job. This is a high value target. If you were going to take this building down, how would you do it? And one of his old Army buddies came and took a look at the building and said, your parking garage is wide open. I'd drive a truck in there full of bombs, park it next to a critical support, blow it up, and that place would come right down. Well, what happened in 1993? It's exactly what happened. So that he brought that to their attention. Prior to that, they didn't take measures to protect that parking garage, and as a result, the building almost came down. Luckily, they didn't park it in the right spot, and it didn't drop. So after that happened, they secured the parking garage, brought his group back in, said, okay, we got the garage taken care of, now what do you think? And one of his comrades said, from the air, I fly a plane into it. And as a result, kind of fast forward a bit, he recognized after the 1993 bombing, it took them about 2.5 hours or so to evacuate all their employees out of that building. Recognized that wasn't good. So he started a very robust program of emergency drills, fire drills, evacuation drills, lockdown drills. Even from some of the executives, it drove him crazy because there'd be a board meeting, and if he was running a drill, I don't care if you're the CEO, get out of the building right now. And so, as is the case with people who do my job, you can be kind of a pain in the butt at the time. And a side note, this morning we did a fire drill at the Capitol. I didn't realize the Supreme Court was hearing oral arguments in the historic chamber. So I had to email the Chief Justice this morning and say, I really apologize we didn't check the court calendar because they only meet in the Capitol once a month. And this time of year, on a Thursday morning, we're usually in the clear, but it wasn't today. Luckily, she was very understanding and said, well, it was probably good practice for us. So the justices were all standing out on the curb in their robes for a while this morning. And I imagine the attorneys weren't too happy about it, but I think they got back on track. At any rate, so he starts this robust program of we are going to be prepared because I think this is going to happen. In fact, he even recommended they move out of the trade centers. He's like, this is a target. This is the target that would be targeted by the people who want to do harm to us. So at any rate, on 9/11, we all know what happened. Planes crashed. He tells his people, I don't care what anybody's saying, get out of the building now. They evacuated within 45 minutes. Everybody got out of the building that was at work that morning, except for who? Him. He stayed and kept helping the firefighters and stayed in the buildings and died in the collapse. Was never recovered. If you want to know more about him, that last line, the man who predicted 9/11, it was a show on the History Channel. It's a few years old, but if you look on YouTube, it pops up, it's 45 minutes. Goes into his background and all the things he did. But point being, sometimes it's not convenient, sometimes it costs some money, but when it happens, it's worth it. He saved thousands of lives because of the actions he took and the preparations that he put in place for Morgan Stanley on 9/11. So, I don't want to run over. So, what's the whole point here? Who's seen this before? What is it? Subway in London. The London subway, if you get on the London subway, you see these signs all over the place. What does it mean?
It means don't step in between the car and the sidewalk.
Yep. The platform of the car, there's a gap there. That's the danger zone. Don't step over there. Don't step in there. Mind the gap. Well, there's gaps all over when it comes to security and preparedness. And my philosophy is, if you do anything, mind your gaps. Find those gaps that exist, whether it is continuity of operations plans. If your computer system goes down, what's your backup? If you have one person that does a critical function within your organization, what happens if they have some misfortune and they can't come to work for 2 weeks? Too many organizations fail because of these single points of failure take down an entire organization. And whether it's a violent intruder attack or something as simple as someone has a medical issue. I know Frank's talking about his hip. I don't have a continuity of operations plan for a haircut, but I'm going to figure it out today, because if he's out and I need my haircut, I got to figure something out. Very small scale, minor consequence issue, but it's that process of what are you going to do if that one thing you rely on is not available. So what are our gaps? It's that gap between where we are today and where we want to be in the future. So the other thing, it's between what we know and what we don't know. And what this all comes down to is focusing on what we can control in our organizations. And then, thankfully, what the federal government did after Oklahoma City 9/11, they've put a lot of frameworks out there for you. All the information is available. Recommendations for small and medium-sized businesses, templates, other things that you can use to build resiliency within your organization that apply over a very broad area of threats. I won't go into a lot of detail on those because I want to make sure we leave time for questions. But what I've found is in some of the organizations I've worked with, the information's out there, but it still takes time and takes energy. It's kind of like when your dryer breaks. I can go on YouTube and probably find a video on how to take it apart, put all the things together and make it work again. But do I have the time? Has that taken me away from something that's more important? And that's where I feel I can fill that gap for organizations that need help with those things, but just don't have the time, expertise, or knowledge to put them forward. So just really quickly before we go to questions, what is an emergency action plan and why is it important? It's really has 4 elements: planning, mitigating risk, response, and recovery. Planning is all the stuff you do ahead of time, training your employees, train them what to do in an active shooter response. And while we focus on, as time has gone by after Columbine, all the focus was on what? Schools. Now what happens if you want to walk into a school? Can I just waltz right in and go to any classroom? No, not at all. Recently, what has been one of the focal points of preparedness with active shooters or violent intruders? Places of worship?
Worship, or yesterday I was at Hubbard Media.
Mm-hmm.
You can't, before people just walk in.
Yep.
No way, it's all, they changed everything at Hubbard.
So, using schools for an example, schools recognize they were a target. And now we've taken steps, we've put countermeasures in place. That doesn't mean that it's infallible, but it's a lot tougher to get into a school now than it used to be. And now we're seeing more and more emphasis on houses of worship, where there's a little conflict there. What do we want our houses of worship to be? Open, inviting, welcoming. Yet, we've seen in recent time, they also can be a target. So at any rate, our planning, which involves risk management, looking at assessing our properties, where are our vulnerabilities, where in our processes are there things that we need to address. Mitigating risk, deciding what we're going to do about those. What can you do about risk? You can put countermeasures up, you can choose to accept them. We practice risk management every day. Every time you get in the vehicle, you practice risk management, whether it's deciding if I'm going to wear my seatbelt or not, if I'm going to speed to get here, weighing out the consequence of possibly getting a speeding ticket versus being late if we're running a little bit behind. So if you think about your everyday life, you're practicing risk management all the time. When I pulled in the parking lot, I look at all the stalls and I go, where can I park which will reduce the risk of my car getting door dinged? And so I go, oh, right over there. I'm only going to possibly get dung on one side. So we do this stuff in our everyday lives all the time. It's just a matter of maybe taking a step back, looking at our organizations and saying, where are the things that I'm maybe not thinking about? And that's where I think the frameworks from the federal government are especially important. I mean, really, if it boils down to 2 or 3 things, it's how do I lock down my business? If something bad is going on outside and I don't want it to get in here, how do I do that? If something bad is happening in here, and how do we get out? We put together a process, tell everybody how it works. If we need to shelter in place, which means it's not necessarily something bad going on out there, but we just can't leave right now, could be a weather event, chemical spill, something that we just need to stay here for a while. Are we prepared to do that for 6, 8, 10 hours if necessary? So it's pretty simple stuff, but it applies in a lot of different areas. Last thing, what we don't want to be is the turkey. So, a book called The Black Swan, if you want to read about risk management, it's a good resource. It talks about the turkey. So the turkey is born, and what does the turkey do every day? Eat, hang out with his buddies, he gets fed every day. Every day is like the day before, right? Everything's great. So to the turkey, why would I expect anything ever to change for me? Right? The farmer, on the other hand, what does he know? Thanksgiving's on its way. And at some point, the turkey's going to get brought somewhere, and he's going to go, what the heck's going on? And then, bam, it's over. So the point is, the turkey just thinks everything's fine, I don't need to worry. The farmer knows there's a day where it's going to come to the end for that turkey. What we don't want to be is the turkeys that just ignore things, think as long as things are going fine, I don't have to worry about it. And not that the turkey can do anything to prevent this from happening, but the reality is what we're trying to stop or resist is just that blindness to the risk. Because whenever something bad happens on the news, what's the first person they interview say? Can't happen here. This kind of stuff doesn't happen here. Well, where does it happen? Everywhere is here, and here is everywhere. Big cities, small towns, rural, urban, suburban. We've been fed this narrative through a lot of different ways. I'm not blaming the media, but we just automatically think it can't happen here. Now, we can't walk around thinking there's a bad guy looking to kill us around every corner, but we at least have to have some idea that it's possible, and we have to do some preparations to be ready for it. I'm going to put my contact information up now. I also have business cards over here if you want to talk to me, but I see we are running up against it. I ran 5 minutes.